It was one of those mornings where the city seemed to hum with an odd kind of energy. The air was crisp, the streets were alive with commuters, and the golden light of the sun spilled over the polished glass of downtown's financial district. At the heart of it all stood a grand, modern bank, a building wrapped in steel and confidence. It was the kind of place where money whispered in private offices and power walked on marble floors. A black luxury sedan glided to a stop in front of the bank's entrance. Out stepped a woman whose presence alone seemed to command the space around her. She wore a fitted charcoal gray suit, her heels clicking sharply against the sidewalk, each step as deliberate as a signature on a contract. Her hair was swept neatly into a bun, her eyes focused and unyielding. She carried herself the way some people carried briefcases, with purpose, precision, and quiet authority. Inside, the bank buzzed with mid-morning activity. Tellers smiled mechanically behind counters, customers shifted impatiently in lines, and the soft murmur of transactions floated through the air. The woman approached the nearest counter, sliding a slip of paper across to the teller. It was a withdrawal request, one that, to the casual observer, might seem unusually large. The teller, a young man with a hesitant expression, scanned the paper and then glanced up at her. His eyes flicked between the withdrawal amount and her face, as though trying to match one to the other. A faint edge of uncertainty crept into his polite tone as he excused himself to speak with a manager. The manager arrived within moments, a middle-aged woman in a navy blazer, carrying the sort of cautious smile that often masks suspicion. She examined the slip, then looked at the customer, and without even attempting subtlety, began asking questions. Where did she work? What was the purpose of the withdrawal? Could she provide additional identification? The words were wrapped in a veneer of professionalism, but beneath them ran an unmistakable current, doubt. The woman answered each question calmly, producing the required documents, sliding over IDs, and even opening her phone to provide verification. But with every step, the manager's demeanor tightened. There were whispered consultations with other staff, more glances, more hesitation. Minutes stretched into nearly half an hour. The woman's composure remained unbroken, but the quiet tension in the room had begun to gather attention from other customers. She noticed how eyes lingered on her, not with curiosity alone, but with a subtle mix of assumption and judgment. The manager finally returned, her smile now gone, replaced with an expression that was part apology, part defiance. She informed the woman that the withdrawal could not be processed without further internal review. The account was flagged for verification, and she would have to wait until higher-level authorization could be obtained. It was an inconvenience that might have been overlooked on another day. But this wasn't another day, and this wasn't an ordinary customer, because while the staff saw a woman in an expensive suit asking for a large sum of money, what they didn't see, at least not yet, was the truth about who she was. The truth was, she wasn't just a customer. She wasn't just someone with a balance in an account. She was the reason the bank existed in the first place. She didn't simply hold an account here, she held the keys. And as the staff continued to stall her, shuffling papers and making calls, they were unaware that they were standing at the edge of a mistake that would not only cost them their pride, but possibly their careers. In that moment, she remained silent, letting the scene unfold. She observed the way the staff exchanged glances, the way the manager subtly leaned over to whisper to another employee while eyeing her from across the counter. The subtle but unmistakable undercurrent of doubt, the kind that too often reveals itself when people decide, without evidence, that someone doesn't look like they belong in certain spaces. Her patience was not infinite, and though she could have revealed her identity at any moment, she didn't, not yet. There was a certain power in watching assumptions play themselves out, in letting people hang themselves with their own rope. When the manager finally suggested that the woman might need to return another day, the tension broke. The woman's eyes locked on the manager's, her voice low and deliberate, carrying the kind of weight that turned heads even from across the lobby. She didn't raise her tone. She didn't need to. And with one short, calculated sentence, she ensured that the next few minutes inside that bank would be etched into everyone's memory. That was when the air in the room seemed to still, when the chatter of customers faded into a stunned quiet. Even the background hum of printers and phones seemed to fade beneath the gravity of her words. It wasn't just the sentence that caught them off guard, it was what it meant. Because for the first time that morning, they realized they hadn't just underestimated a customer, they had underestimated the owner. For a long, frozen moment, the bank lobby hung in a stunned silence. It wasn't the sort of silence born of confusion. It was the kind that came when certainty collapsed in an instant. The manager's eyes flickered, trying to decide whether she'd misheard or if she was now standing at the epicenter of a mistake she couldn't undo. The sentence still lingered in the air, but its weight was already settling over the room like a slow, heavy snowfall. A few customers craned their necks, others shifted uncomfortably, sensing the invisible shift in power. Somewhere in the back, a teller stopped mid-transaction, his pen hovering over a deposit slip as he stared toward the scene. The manager's polite mask began to crack. She asked, with a voice that was no longer quite as firm, if the woman could wait a moment while she confirmed something. Her words were careful, but her steps were hurried as she disappeared into the glass-walled office that overlooked the lobby. Inside, the blinds tilted shut with a soft rattle. Through the glass, shapes moved quickly, a flurry of hands gesturing, a phone lifted, a head shaking in disbelief. The branch's assistant manager slipped inside, closing the door behind him. They spoke in low tones, but their movements were sharp, their faces tense. The atmosphere inside that office was no longer one of quiet control. It was damage control. The woman in the charcoal suit didn't move. She stood where she had been all along, her posture still tall, her expression unreadable. To anyone watching, it was unclear whether she was angry, amused, or simply waiting. The truth was, she didn't need to be anything. The room was already doing the work for her. Meanwhile, in the office, the branch manager's call to the regional director had been answered. What began as a guarded explanation soon turned into rapid, almost stammering clarification. The name was repeated twice, then spelled out. Silence followed. And then, with a tone that carried both shock and urgency, the regional director's voice came through the lens, instructing them to resolve the matter immediately, and to do so with every courtesy possible. The manager emerged from the office moments later, her composure visibly shaken. She smoothed her blazer, her steps faster now, her eyes darting around as though searching for the right script to follow. She approached the woman, her tone abruptly warmer, almost deferential, as she assured her that the issue had been cleared up and that her transaction would be processed right away. But if the manager thought this sudden change would erase what had just happened, she was mistaken. The woman didn't acknowledge the apology. She simply waited while the teller, now visibly nervous, counted the bills with meticulous care. The sound of the counting machine filled the space, punctuated by the occasional shuffle of crisp notes. Every customer in the lobby seemed to be watching now. Some were curious, some quietly delighted by the unexpected drama, and a few were clearly piecing together what her earlier words had meant. When the money was finally placed before her, neatly stacked and secured, she didn't reach for it right away. Instead, she let the moment stretch just a little longer, the silence pressing in on the staff. She knew the effect it was having, the way they now saw her differently, the way the balance of power had shifted so completely. In those seconds, the unspoken truth settled over the room. The people who had doubted her had in fact been working for her all along. She took the money, placed it neatly into her briefcase, and closed it with a soft click. Then, without a glance backward, she turned and walked toward the doors, the echo of her heels following her out into the sunlight. But the story didn't end at the glass doors. Inside that branch, the shock still lingered. Employees exchanged hushed words, speculating, replaying the morning in their minds. Somewhere in the corporate offices, emails were being drafted, calls scheduled, damage assessment, minutes made. The incident had already moved beyond the branch. It had entered the corridors of higher authority where reputations were dissected and consequences assigned. For the woman, this wasn't an isolated inconvenience. It was part of a much larger pattern she knew all too well. A pattern of assumptions and gatekeeping that had shadowed her throughout her career. She had learned long ago how to turn moments like this into leverage, how to let the weight of silence speak louder than confrontation. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even surprised. But she was taking notes. And those notes, once acted upon, would not just change the way this branch treated her. They would change the way the entire institution operated, from the bottom floor to the highest executive office. Because she didn't just own this bank in name. She owned it in influence, in control, in the power to decide who thrived here and who didn't. And after this morning, she knew exactly where the changes needed to start. The week that followed was not quiet for the bank. What had begun as a tense scene in the branch lobby was now a ripple spreading through the entire corporate structure. At first, it moved in whispers, emails sent between regional managers, calls placed to human resources, the compliance department quietly pulling surveillance footage. But soon, the ripple became a wave, and the wave demanded answers. In a sleek conference room at the bank's downtown headquarters, the woman sat at the head of the table. Around her were the institution's senior executives, the kind of people whose job titles came with stock options and whose calendars were guarded by assistants. They knew her not as a customer, but as the chair of the board, the individual whose vote could shape the bank's leadership for years. On the glossy surface before her were two folders. One held a detailed report of the incident, from the first moment she had stepped up to the teller's counter to the moment she had walked out. The other contained the personnel records of everyone involved. She had read them both. The executives shifted in their seats. A few cleared their throats. Others stared at their hands. They were used to discussing market performance, not being summoned over the behavior of branch staff. But here, the message was clear. This was not about money. This was about culture, perception, and the quiet, corrosive biases that could undo everything the bank claimed to stand for. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Instead, she laid out the facts, not as accusations, but as evidence. How the teller had deferred to the manager without explanation. How the manager had escalated the situation not with curiosity, but with suspicion. How she had complied with every request, only to be met with more roadblocks. And then she explained what this meant, not just for her personally, but for the institution's reputation. She spoke of the trust that customers placed in the bank, and how quickly that trust could be destroyed when frontline staff acted on assumption rather than professionalism. She didn't tell them how to feel. She told them what needed to change. The directives were clear. A mandatory training program for all employees on customer bias and procedural integrity. A revised escalation policy to ensure that transactions, regardless of size or customer profile, were handled with consistent, documented protocol. And quietly but firmly, personnel changes in key positions at the branch. The executives listened. They nodded. They took notes. By the time the meeting ended, the decision had been made. 2 days later, the branch manager was reassigned to an administrative roles in another city. The teller remained, but only after completing the new training program, the first in the bank to do so. The assistant manager, who had stood silently in the glass office during the incident, was promoted to lead the branch under new guidance. Inside the branch, the atmosphere shifted. Staff were more deliberate, more careful in their interactions. The changes were subtle, but they were there. The way customers were greeted, the absence of the quick, appraising glances that used to follow certain clients. As for the woman, she did not return to that branch for several months. When she did, it was not for a transaction, but for a quarterly inspection in her capacity as board chair. She walked through the lobby, noting the improved flow of service, the confident but respectful tone of the staff. And though no one said it aloud, they all knew who she was now. Not because of the title on her business card, but because of the shadow her presence cast. The reminder that their assumptions had once been wrong, and that they had learned from it. Outside, as she stepped back into her waiting car, she looked once at the building's polished glass facade. It reflected the city skyline, the movement of people, the constant churn of business. She had not set out that morning weeks ago to teach a lesson, but the lesson had been taught all the same. Not just to a single branch, but to the institution itself. Power, she knew, was not always in raising your voice. Sometimes it was in holding the silence just long enough for others to hear themselves. And in this case, it was in reminding them, without ever needing to say it twice, that she didn't just have an account here. She owned the place.